Hello, everyone. This is Joe Brewer, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to this new learning journey, Living into the Design Pathway. Today is going to be our first webinar together for this group, although several of you I know and have interacted with you in this format before. For those of you who are new to Crowdcast, the live streaming tool that we'll be using for these webinars, I just want to give you a little bit of a lay of how we can use this technology to help us in the webinars. And so the first thing that I'll share is that it's really nice to use the chat box, as many of you are already doing, to greet and say hello. And so during the presentation part of the webinars, I encourage you to use the chat to interact with each other, to post comments, to have discussions, to share links to things that you're talking about. We generally find that this chat box over here on the side is a lively place of parallel learning during the webinars, because there are so many people who attend these sessions that just have a lot of knowledge and experience of their own, as I'm sure you're already beginning to experience on Earth Regenerators. There's just so much capacity among the people who have joined this community. So I really want to encourage you to reach out to your peers and get to know each other in every opportunity, including during the webinars while I'll be presenting. So please use the chat to do that while we go. The other thing is that the basic format of these webinars is that I'm going to offer about a 25-minute presentation today, and then we'll have an additional half an hour for 1 hour in total, where we'll be able to have some discussion. And one of the ways that Crowdcast enables us to have discussions is there's a little button right here, a little option that says ask a question. So during the presentation, at any time, you can go there and type a question that you'd like to have answered. Also, you can go there and vote for all of the questions that you see others have posted, and you can vote for the ones that you would like to see answered. And then what we'll do is when the presentation is over, we will select the questions that get the most votes and go from the most popular questions to the least popular questions. And we actually have the ability to invite the people who ask the questions to come into a split screen. So they'll be invited into a video conferencing mode where we can discuss the question together with so whoever asks the questions can share more of what they were thinking about the question. I can offer some reflections, and then we can talk a little bit about it, which gives us a bit more of interaction than just watching a presentation and then going away. The other thing is we have this nice polling feature where I can offer a poll, which I'm going to do now, and you can answer it to start getting a sense of how you relate to other people in the group. And so I've got a poll right here that's ready for all of us, and I'm just going to make it visible. And so I'd just love to know, how does everyone feel? I've given you a list of options here. If you would just go to this poll and start answering it. Are you feeling excited and ready to go, curious and maybe a little more reserved, or wondering what's going to emerge here? Maybe nervous about the world and just feeling this sense of anxiousness and maybe even a little fear about what's going on in the world. Maybe you're not sure how you fit into this idea of regenerating the entire planet and how to live regeneratively. Or perhaps you're just sort of open to discovering new things and you're not quite sure what's going to happen, but you feel okay and maybe even feel pretty good about it. And what I see is we're getting a lot of people who are excited and a lot of people who are curious. A few who are nervous, or I'm guessing a lot of us are nervous about what's happening in the world. And being unsure how we fit in is actually a great place to start. And being open to discovery means we'll be surprised by something pleasant that happens, and it'll be something that we didn't know was coming, but we'll learn and grow from it. So thank you. This is just a nice little example of how we can start to interact with each other here in these webinars using some of the tools that are available to us. So thank you for filling out this poll. And so what we're going to do in a moment is I'm going to begin a presentation. And the presentation will begin by setting some of our big picture agenda. So covering in a little bit more personal way what was offered as the homework assignment for this last week in preparation for starting the learning journey, where we'll talk about the planetary context and what's already happening and what's emerging in the world as we seek to do regenerative healing work, healing social and cultural work on the human side, and restorative regenerative work of ecosystems and landscapes on the larger, more than human side. And so I'm going to have this presentation, and then it'll start to weave into what is this learning journey about? What are we setting ourselves up for in the next 2 months? Where do we think we're going to go? And then also just a little bit of a how-to for using the platform that we'll be using on Earth Regenerators to enable us to, I have someone joining the course who should really be here right now, so I'm going to approve them. There we go. And then I'll close that so we don't hear the beeps anymore. Perfect. And then what we're going to have is this little tutorial, little how-to on how we're going to be using the course infrastructure on Mighty Networks, where Earth Regenerators is located, and how we'll be incorporating that into the weekly Zoom calls and webinars. And I'm noticing that it's starting to rain where I'm sitting, so I'm going to move from here in the courtyard of our house, where I don't have shelter, to a more boring backdrop of just a white wall, so that the computer doesn't get rained on. And you'll see that I'm very comfortable improvising and making things up as we go along. So I'm looking forward to learning right alongside the rest of you as we go through all of this. And so with that said, let's begin. Let's start our learning journey formally together. I know that we had a meet and greet and 2 community Zoom calls on Monday. So several of you have already been talking with each other, and a lot of you are familiar faces that have been around Earth Regenerators for a while. So a little bit of what I'll cover today may be a bit of a review. But just as your reminder, please use the chat box to talk with each other and share ideas and get into dialogues during the presentation. Use the Ask a Question feature right here to pose questions you'd like to have answered, and vote for the questions you most want to hear answered. And we'll use those to shape our question and answer in our discussion period after the presentation. And then otherwise, let's just get started, because the world is in chaos and there's no time to waste. So with that said, I'm going to start screen share. Here we go. And the presentation begins. So today's presentation is an introduction to this learning journey, living into the design pathway for regenerating Earth. And what I really want to stress at the beginning is that it's helpful for us to step back and take a big picture view of where we are right now, so that we can see what is decaying, collapsing, and dying, and what is ascending, emerging, and being born in the moment that we're in, the geologic, the historic, planetary moment that we're in, that's going to shape the rest of our lives and the way that we make choices about how to live in the next week, the next month, the next 10 years, and even for our children and grandchildren, how they're going to live. I want to start by giving a little bit of a personal context. Here's my daughter, Elise. Many of you know her from other webinars and other places where she's made appearances. What I really want to emphasize is that I come into this discussion of planetary collapse and Earth regeneration with eyes wide open. My wife and I have a daughter that's 4.5 years old. Here's a picture of her on her birthday back in January of this year. And what I really want to stress is that as afraid as I have been of the possible future, the dystopia, the apocalypse, the terrible things that are coming, my wife and I had a very long conversation. It lasted about 10 years about whether or not we should have children, knowing what we know about the world. And we ended up making the decision that we would choose to have a child because we want to have skin in the game, because we believe that humans are something positive and beneficial to this planet, and we want humans to stick around. And so we had a child. And what this did was it opened us to a pathway of personal transformation, individually and as a family, as we have sought to live as ethically as we can in service to the future of our child. And this has radicalized us. It has emboldened us. It has helped us to make deeper, bigger changes, and we ain't finished yet. We have a long way to go. So what I want to share is that in the last 4.5 years, my wife and I have been practicing a lot of things we'll be discussing in this learning journey. How to definancialize your life, how to get more connected to land, how to become part of a bioregion, how to raise children for the future that we know is coming, and a whole lot more. And we do this with the precious body of our own child placed in harm's way, knowing what is coming in the future. And I just want to start with that as a context for how I'm engaging in this discourse, this conversation with all of you. Another thing we're going to explore is how the heck did this couple, Joe and Jessica and their daughter Elise, move from the United States and end up finding ourselves in Barichara, Colombia? How did we end up in a small mountain village in the northern Andes? Why is it that we would have a place like this here in the foreground, which is a reforestation project called Bioparque Moncora, where we've been helping with reforestation and landscape regeneration for the last 1.5 years? How could we come from living in Seattle, where our daughter was born, to gradually moving further and further away from the extractive economy and all of its constraints, to be empowered and liberated to live this way and do this work? I hope that our experience in our own lives is helpful to all of you as we grapple with this together. And I really look forward to learning from your struggles and your successes to help our family improve as we're trying to do this too. Okay, we started last week with a homework exercise that included this graph. This is kind of a scary image because it says the human population is going to overshoot and collapse. The assumption, the assertion, the declaration is as human population overshoots and collapse. It's not, can we avoid it? It might happen, and maybe we should be concerned. We might be able to escape it somehow. I actually have reason to believe that this is inevitable, and that the unsustainable cultures, including the globalized economy that is doing so much damage to the world environment today, are going to become compost for Earth's biosphere. And the mission of the Earth Regenerators study group and all of our related activities, the Design School for Regenerating Earth, all of them are about keeping this green dashed line from ever getting to zero. That as the human population rises to 9 billion or whatever number it reaches and starts a precipitous collapse, some of the best scenario estimates of this say it starts around 2040 or 2050 when the population begins to go down. But regardless, we don't know when it's actually going to happen. But we need to have a very strong strategy, a very clear understanding of how to keep the human population from going to zero, which means game over, human extinction. And the idea is we want to get as many people as we can off of the white line and onto the green dashed line, where we live in regenerative cultures, we create regenerative economies, and we heal, restore, and maintain the health of ecosystems as a way of preserving the future of humanity, but also for all of the non-human species, the estimated 10 to 100 million of them that are at risk if a mass extinction event truly does occur caused by human hands. So our mission is to get ourselves onto this green dashed line, and then to become social supports to help others get on this green dashed line. That is the work before us, and that is the focus of this learning journey. I want to start now with a little bit of the planetary context. A couple weeks ago, the Arctic Circle got to 48 degrees Celsius, 118 degrees Fahrenheit. This has never happened before. And this is an important thing for us to think about. Is this the blue ocean event? The blue ocean event being when the Arctic Ocean becomes free of ice during the Northern Hemisphere's summer. When the ice surface that is white, that reflects 90% of sunlight back into space, is replaced by dark blue ocean that absorbs 90% of the energy of the sun and rapidly heats the ocean. And also in the absence of ice, instead of the ocean temperature staying close to freezing, it can actually rise and have a positive feedback or an accelerating or an amplifying effect of the atmospheric temperature. So one of the biggest ways of destabilizing the entire planetary climate is for the Arctic Ocean to become ice-free when the sun is aimed toward it because of the angle of the Earth, which is in the northern hemisphere's summer. And there's now good evidence that the blue ocean event is coming sometime in the next few years. Some estimates are as late as by 2040 or 2050. But what if it's happening right now? When we have a temperature of 118 degrees Fahrenheit in the Arctic Circle, as happened about 2 weeks ago, we need to be asking ourselves, is the planetary climate going into abrupt, catastrophic change? This is a very real question, and it's very present moment by moment, and we need to pay attention to it. Also, on the land base, not just on the ocean, we're watching the imminent collapse of the Amazon basin, which is a forest that has existed for 40 million years, consecutively and continuously. And the Amazon rainforest, the world's largest forest, is currently at risk of collapsing and becoming grassland savanna, going from being a huge sink or recipient of carbon from the atmosphere to a massive source of releasing carbon into the Earth's atmosphere, which will accelerate climate change. But of course, it also represents a massive loss in cultural diversity and biodiversity through the loss of the human indigenous cultures of the Amazon rainforest and through the loss of estimates several million species that are in the Amazon rainforests. So why do I say that this collapse is imminent? Because there's a combination of deforested surface area together with fragmentation, where the forested areas that remain are separate from each other like little islands, which is losing a giant hydrological pump at the continental scale of South America. And as this hydrological pump fails, there's a tipping point where the vast forest systems of the Amazon transition in the span of 10 to 20 years, maybe up to 30 years, for the world's largest forest that's existed for 40 million years to permanently transition to grassland. And the estimates for when this tipping point will be reached are somewhere around 2023 or 2024. It's right around the corner. So this massive shift of the world's largest forest is imminent, and all signs of economic activity tell us that we're not going to stop it in time. So here is another imminent and current challenge that's part of the global context. Also, there's a thing called the thermohaline circulation, or the ocean conveyor belt, which moves heat as a giant pump through a ribbon of water, the ocean current system. And what's amazing is if you look up here on the left at Greenland, where the surface water is red, which is warm, and it sinks and becomes cold water at the ocean floor, as Greenland melts and releases huge amounts of fresh water, it could shut down this ocean current system, which transports a huge amount of heat from the equator up toward the poles, which would cause a massive shift in the weather systems of the planet. So if you think of the changes in the El Nino and La Nina in the Pacific Ocean, or the Southeast Asian monsoon, which is so important for India and places like Thailand and Vietnam, that these systems could be radically changed by the shift in this ocean current system. And it's largely determined by how quickly Greenland's ice melts. And its ice is melting faster and faster every year, and faster than most of the conservative forecasts of climate policy reports. So this is another thing that seems to be imminent and could happen within the next decade. There's evidence now that this ocean current system is weakening in the North Atlantic, which means the whole system may shut down in the next 10 to 20 years. So this is another thing that's happening right now that we need to be dealing with as we think of doing regenerative work. At a more local level, we can see the consequences around us right now. And those of you who are on the western side of North America especially those near the Pacific coast, are going to be very familiar with things like this. My friend Ruby Reed posted on Facebook last week that their organic farm in central Oregon, or in southern Oregon, was burned to the ground in a wildfire. But here's the thing, 9 months ago, during the last wildfire season, they had another farm burned to the ground and they relocated to this one. So they've lost 2 farms in the span of 9 months to extreme wildfire events in southern Oregon. And then this morning I saw this, where one of our members of Earth Regenerators, Jonathan Kabat, who was really active in Earth Regenerators last year, he and his partner Lauren have been running an eco-restoration camp in Northern California near Mount Shasta, and it burned to the ground last night. So these are 2 things that are happening right now. And for those of you who are not aware, the Gulf of Mexico is on fire. There is an oil pipeline under the ocean that has started a fire. And look, that fire is coming from the ocean floor, bubbling up and spraying out flame at the surface of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico as they're trying to figure out how to put out the fire. And this is also happening right now, which leads to a really important, troubling, serious observation, which is that the life of an Earth regenerator is to continue loving and to feel the pain and loss, even as many places that we love get destroyed, even places that we are personally regenerating with our own hands, like Jonathan and Lauren in Northern California, and like Ruby and her team in Southern Oregon. So if we're going to take on a life of regeneration, that means we're going to open our hearts to the sensitivity of pain and loss as these things continue to unfold. And that means we're going to need a lot of support from our friends. We're going to need a lot of help. And that's one of the big things about these learning journeys and Earth regenerators in general, is how much we focus on supportive relationships to each other and working in small groups to build our capacities to manage these difficult times and to do very important regenerative work. Yes, Elise, I'm having a call right now, so I can't really talk to you. But maybe you can ask Mama if she would read that with you.
No, I'm not asking to read.
Yeah?
I didn't find a picture of it.
Oh, well, go talk to Mama about it, because I'm actually giving a presentation right now.
But now
My daughter came over to see me.
I can show you.
So, Elise, sweetie, please go over and see Mama. Thank you. What I want to do now is start to shift from how big and serious the problems are to the scale of and the possibilities for the solution. And I want to do that with a framework that many of you are already familiar with. The Stockholm Resilience Center created a framework called Planetary Boundaries, where they asked the question, what are the processes and dynamic patterns of the entire Earth system that, if they cross some critical threshold, would make it impossible to have a globalized human economy? They identified 9 of these, and they said, okay, well, if there are 9 of them, to the best of our knowledge, remember, if we cross even one, then the globalized economy becomes untenable and it's going to collapse. So if that means even one of them is crossed, that we don't have a globalized economy, how many of these 9 have we crossed? According to the best information as of 2011, they said we've crossed 4. We are in overshoot. And so the 4 that we've crossed, I'll just go with those for now, are the one is called biosphere integrity, which is basically a measure of species extinctions or biodiversity loss. They found that we're losing biodiversity too quickly. And as food webs and ecosystems unravel, they become fragile and brittle. Eventually, they get to the point where they'll unravel the entire biosphere, which, of course, would mean a mass extinction event, and humans would go extinct along with it. They also found something called biogeochemical flows, which is the amount of phosphorus and reactive nitrogen that are moving around. By the way, this is nitrogen fertilizer in industrial agriculture. And that these 2 are the most extreme and the fastest to cause a human extinction event. The third one, which is quite important, they call land system change, which is taking the complexity of intact ecosystems and reducing their complexity by turning forests into fields and fields into cities, where the ecology becomes less complex and therefore more brittle. And this land system change is itself causing a massive unraveling of the Earth's biosphere. And then coming in at number 4, and barely across the threshold, is climate change, which is past its threshold, but not yet in the danger zone. Although, as we saw with the previous slides about abrupt climate change, I think that we could say that it actually is in the danger zone as well. And the important thing to keep in mind is that all of these processes are related to each other. So as one of them runs into a cascading collapse, it'll actually trigger cascading collapses in the others. On the flip side, what this tells us is if we could somehow bring all 4 of those back within planetary boundaries, that we would restore planetary health. So another way of thinking about this is here is our target. If we were to shoot an arrow, we want to aim for the green area in the center. And we want to bring all 9 of these planetary processes back within a balanced, harmonious place, which means we need to very quickly stop biodiversity loss, very quickly reduce the cycling of phosphorus and nitrogen, very quickly change our management of landscapes from the destruction of ecosystems to the regeneration of ecosystems. And by doing all of this, we will address climate change. And this kind of tells us how to regenerate the entire planet. When we get into the details of what it means to maintain biodiversity, to transition from industrial agriculture to alternative ways of growing food that don't use nitrogen fertilizer, and to engage in regenerative land practices instead of destructive land practices. And of course, to stop using fossil fuels and other things related to land system change and climate change. Here's another interesting map that we can reframe. This is a map of degraded landscapes, where there's an estimated 3 to 4 billion hectares, about 35% of the land surface of the entire planet, that is currently degraded by human activities. But what's interesting about degraded land, as I've been learning by digging my fingers in the dirt and working to restore degraded land, is that every piece of degraded land is a potential ecosystem restoration site. So this is also a map of regenerative potential. We have between 3 and 4 billion hectares, 1/3 of the land area of the entire planet, where human beings living in any of these areas, especially the ones that are red or this orangish color, these especially, but also the brown ones, these are all places where we could actively participate in restoring landscapes and regenerate degraded land. Notice how pretty much all of the United States, pretty much all of South America, nearly all of Africa, and about 75% of Europe and Asia, and about half of Australia meet these criteria. So this is just something to say the scale of our opportunity is as big as the scale of the predicament that we're in. The other thing we need to know is that the thing that caused this planetary collapse process and all of these very dangerous scenarios that we're now discovering are real, the root cause is what I call runaway cultural evolution, which is that human cultures accumulate capacities that allow us to go bigger, stronger, and faster in the scaling of things until we outpace the natural regenerative patterns of the Earth itself. And the system that has done this most powerfully is a globalized system of wealth extraction that arose in the form of colonial empires, civilizations, and globalized trade networks, which were given a huge intensification with fossil fuels about 150 years ago. And this massive extractive system, hoarding wealth by destroying landscapes elsewhere, like when the Spanish royalty came and stole gold and minerals from Colombia, where I'm living now, this extraction of wealth is how that system is defined. By the way, today we call it globalized capitalism, but it doesn't really matter which name we give it. What matters is the economic system is inherently extractive, inherently unfair, it generates inequality, and it destroys ecosystems. And so we need to move from this globalized system of wealth extraction to something else, which is what we're going to talk about now. Another way of visualizing that graphic I showed earlier of the big white curve of human population reaching a peak and collapsing is that we're passing through an evolutionary bottleneck, which is just a term for when there's a large population and the population gets a lot smaller. And as the population gets smaller, the capacities, the behaviors, the technologies, the tools, the social values, the worldviews of those cultures that remain become more important. And what you can see is on the left, we have a lot of extractive cultures that are pretty big and a number of regenerative cultures, each of which is small. And what we need to have happen is as we pass through this evolutionary bottleneck, all of the extractive cultures die out and become compost for regenerative cultures. And all that's left on the other side is regenerative cultures. So another way of thinking about our work in this learning journey is how do we create these regenerative cultures? How do we protect them during an extended period of collapse and turbulence? And then how do we spread them around the world? Well, we have a way to do that, which is that we focus at the scale of bioregions, and we create bioregions or territorial scale economies that are structured around regeneration. And we organize them around larger landscape structures. Like here I'm showing South America, where the two largest land structures are the Andes mountain range, which is the red dots going from north to south, and the yellow dots, which represent the Amazon rainforest, the Amazon River, and all of its different sub-rivers, the river systems that join to become the Amazon basin. And what's interesting is if each bioregional or territorial economy becomes connected to others through larger structures and landscapes and larger ecological patterns, they can actually organize themselves like a fractal to work really well in their local context and collaborate across territories to reach larger scales like entire continents. So if we can create local regenerative economies in each bioregion, we can organize and network them across continents. And if we can do that, we can go even further and look at every continent as mountain ranges, river systems, islands, coastal estuaries, naturally organized ecosystems, where humans can seek to find harmony with those ecosystems in their local context and create local living economies. And if we do this across every continent on Earth, we will replace the globalized extractive wealth system with a planetary network of bioregional regenerative economies, which is what I call the design pathway for regenerating Earth. The design pathway is to create local living economies and to network them across the functional relationships of landscapes, scaling up to entire continents and to the planet as a whole. That is another way of thinking about how we do our work together in the next 2 months and for the rest of our lives. Now, a thing to keep in mind about an earlier time of collapse, which was isolated mostly in Western Europe, is that during what are called the Dark Ages of Europe, of the Western civilization, monasteries up in the mountains were the wisdom holders, the places where knowledge was protected in scrolls and in books, and in knowledge passed down from generation to generation, as the world outside went through things like the bubonic plague and the 100 Years' War and other kinds of turbulence and chaos. What we need today is we need to have regenerative economies as the wisdom holders. Here's an example from where we are in Barichara, Colombia, where we started mapping out the water retention projects, the reforestation projects, the agroforestry projects, the places where people are recharging their aquifers, the places where children are going to forest schools to learn about ecology of the local place. And we see this network ecosystem at the territorial scale as being the embodiment of wisdom in the knowledge and practice of regenerative projects. So is this really possible to do? Well, here's a quote from Masanobu Fukuoka, the founder of natural farming, when he said, "It was in an American desert that I suddenly realized Rain does not fall from the heavens. It comes from the ground. Desert formation is not due to absence of rain, but the rain ceases to fall because the vegetation has disappeared. Building a dam in the middle of the desert is like trying to treat only one symptom. But the only way to increase rainfall is to learn how to regenerate old forests. What's amazing about this insight of Fukuoka is that it was demonstrated at large scale in the Los Plateau of China between the 1990s and 2012. Here's a before and after picture of an extremely eroded landscape, a severe desert after 5,000 years of agriculture and civilization destroying it. And in less than 20 years, they brought back the green lushness of this landscape and turned the desert into a forest agriculture mecca, a place that produces a huge amount of organic produce for the Chinese urban settings. And they did this in 20 years. They brought the rain back by re-greening the desert. And this is a real-world example that John Liu made a documentary about called Green Gold. So you can go and watch that. It's actually under tools and tutorials in the Earth Regenerators on the Earth Regenerators platform, or you can look it up on YouTube as well. But what's important is this is an example of turning a desert into a lush environment in 20 years on the scale of more than 100,000 hectares, more than 200,000 acres of land. So this was a large-scale ecosystem restoration project, and it worked. What this means is this can really be done. It really can be done. There are examples already that we can look to where people have done it. So we can copy what they did, learn from their lessons, learn from their mistakes and their successes, and we can do it too. And the important thing is we don't wait for the right elected official. We don't wait for the right technology genius. We don't wait for billionaire philanthropists to save us, because that is not going to happen. The truth is, we are the ones we have been waiting for. The people who will save humanity from destruction will be the humans who care enough to do something about what's going on now, which is to step out of the extractive economy step by step. It turns out that's a difficult thing to do, so we'll be exploring that a lot in this learning journey, and to participate in the regeneration of landscapes and the creation of regenerative economies. So let's go back to this graphic again. And I want to tell you where most sustainability work goes wrong and why it won't work. It's because they focus in the wrong place. A lot of people try to create a sustainable planetary system way up here. Let's create sustainable cities and a sustainable planet for 9 billion humans. What they don't understand is that the top of this curve is extreme. It's abnormal. Nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. And everything about the society that created this global system, everything about it is the exemplar of unsustainability. So if we think we're going to make the most unsustainable human culture in history, if we're going to make that sustainable, which it's a fool's errand, it's just not going to work. The other thing is, a lot of people focus their sustainability work in trying to stop this collapse. What I want to tell you from my own experience in grief and trauma is that when I let go of the need to stop this, when I stopped being afraid of collapse, I was open to discovering the third way, which is this. All of the models, all of the technologies, all of the techniques, all of the lifestyles to study and emulate are on this green dashed line. We're not going to find them on the white curve. The amazing thing is that there's been a global permaculture movement since the 1960s. There are tens of thousands of permaculture projects. There are people doing ecosystem restoration all over the planet. There are people figuring out how to transition small towns off of fossil fuels, 10,000 strong. There are thousands of eco-villages and intentional communities around the world where people are experimenting with different ways of doing things. So the thing is, all of those models exist, but when we're spending all of our time up on this white curve, trying to make the exemplar of unsustainability sustainable. We're being so afraid of an apocalyptic future that we're paralyzed from taking action, that we don't manage to go to where we need to be, which is to where the models of Earth regeneration exist, where people have actually proven it can be done. And you can join them, you can lead them, you can invite others to join you, and take these models and spread them to different places around the world. Here's an insight from the group, the Balaton group, which is the group that created the Limits to Growth study, a famous study published in 1972, the first ever attempt to study the global economy, which showed the human population crashing around 2040. And after 10 years of the best minds they could find all gathering and asking, what would it take to create a sustainable future for humanity? They came to this: regenerate the Earth with bioregional learning centers. And here's a quote from one of their reports. Each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region. Said another way, we can transfer the capacity to do ecological design. Say, we knew how to design for the ecology of this place, so now let's go and do design for the ecology of this different place. And the ecological design process is the same. The ecological designs, the interventions, are context specific. So each place needs its own learning center to figure out how to build these capacities, which resulted in this quote from Donella Meadows. Out of this 10 years of work came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. So when I say we need this planetary network of bioregional economies, this quote comes from a report from Dana Meadows, published in 1983. In 1983, I was 7 years old. So when I was just a kid playing on the playground, the adults had already figured out what we need to do. Between the time I was 7 years old and now when I'm about to turn 45, what's happened is the adults didn't show up. What we've seen consistently since then is a pathological kind of adolescence pretending to be leaders all over the planet as the world got worse and worse and worse. Those of us who are going to be the healthy adults and the healthy elders moving into this time of planetary collapse and Earth regeneration need to learn how to be responsible for our own bioregions by creating bioregional learning centers for each of them. Each bioregion is going to create a whole system model for its own regeneration. It also becomes a place for having a network of exchange where what we learn in one place can be transferred to another place about how to do this kind of ecological design. And if we do this across the entire planet, then we actually have a shot at regenerating the Earth. So now, here we are at this learning journey, 2 months together. What could we possibly do when the mission is so large? And here's what I came up with as an answer. Each of us can figure out how to bring a little more life and a little more thriving to wherever our fingers can touch the ground. My family's doing that in Colombia right now. Some of our friends, as I mentioned earlier, are weeping and grieving about the places their hands touch the earth in California and Oregon as the wildfires are causing devastation there. And each of us is going to ask ourselves, where is home? Where is the place where I can give my love to a little piece of the earth? This opens up an exploration for us. Is this simply about planting trees? No, it's something much more holistic than that. Yesterday, as I was preparing for this webinar, I asked myself, how would I describe in a simple way, what is a regenerative life? And this is simple, meaning I'm not trying to capture everything here, but I want to give you an impression that I at least think goes in the right direction. So here's what I came up with. A regenerative life creates circulation of material flow, which is basically a circular economy. Everything that's where your food comes from, your clothing, the building materials for your shelter, your energy needs, everything about your life is in a circulation a whole life cycle circulation of recycling, the way that living systems do it. Also, human beings need to cooperate across landscapes. So a regenerative life is being part of cooperation in the landscape where you live, helping protect a fishery, helping to restore a river, helping to regenerate a forest, working across landscapes and cooperating with other people where you live. A third thing is a regenerative life is organized around ecological connections, river drainages, biological corridors for the migration of animals, weather systems that connect one landscape to another, glaciers up in mountain peaks that bring freshwater supplies to the valleys below. We organize our life around the ecological connections of the landscapes and the atmospheres in which we're embedded. A regenerative life is liberated from the debt slavery system, which means we don't have to work to make money to pay debt as this extractive system destroys life on Earth. We become freed from that and have more emotional space to heal, more mental space to create, and more physical energy and time to give ourselves to regenerative projects. So we have to have a pathway of liberation from a debt slavery economy. A regenerative life heals cultural trauma. Many of us are born into a world where we go to daycare at 2 months old because both of our parents are working full-time corporate jobs. Many of us still remember our indigenous ancestors who are the victims of colonization, conquest, and genocide. Those of us who don't remember are also victims of it, and our forgetting is part of our cultural trauma. Everyone has cultural trauma to heal from, and a regenerative life during this time includes actively embracing grief and trauma and working to heal from it. A regenerative life is about cultivation of the sacred. It's not seeking money and looking for wealth and fame and trying to have a big mansion and a big car and the next technology thing and the latest distraction and more young, beautiful people to be around. The cultivation of the sacred is about finding deep meaning and deep purpose and recovering our sacred relationship to the rest of life. Also, a regenerative life is about becoming fully human, not just being a mindless consumer or an urban resident, but a fully active, interdependent part of a life system of a place, which is what human beings are. Human beings are a conscious, aware, loving, caring, hunting, gathering, capable part of a living ecosystem. This means a regenerative life is also about becoming the culture of the future indigenous people who will come into being after this extractive system is gone. And I'll let that be a sort of mysterious provocation. What is the future indigenous that we can explore in the next 2 months? That's something that I'm exploring in my life right now and finding it deeply powerful, very humbling, and very difficult work. So here is my snapshot of a regenerative life. We want to learn how to do this for each person in this learning journey to then enable us to help other people to do it as well. So overall, the path of the learning journey that we're on looks like this. We want to map out what it means to live regeneratively, which I just gave you an example of, a starting point for our discussions. And then we want to create the support structures for each other to live more regeneratively than we are now. And that will help us in the next 2 months to start making decisions and taking actions to begin living more regeneratively than each of us is right now. This is our path, is just to map out what it means, create supports for each other, and begin to take actions and make decisions. That's something I think is achievable in 2 months' time. And this begins today with the kickoff webinar, and then our first round of community Zoom calls that are connected with the learning journey. And notice that we added back the Sunday time. Elise, could you please be more quiet? I can't hear very well. Thank you. Thank you, sweetie. That we're actually going to have a session tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central. And then the 2 times from last week for the meet and greet sessions, we'll have both of those again. The reason we're doing 3 is that we realized when we changed from the Sunday to the Monday schedule that some people couldn't participate. And we're not sure what the right configuration is for week to week. So for this week, we're going to offer 3 and see what works best for everyone. So you'll be able to go to the course page, as I'll show you in a moment how to get there, and sign up for these events and choose the community Zoom call you'd like to attend this week. And then we'll assess based on your participation if we keep these 3 times or if we reduce it back to 2 based on how things go this week. So just a brief overview of the course itself and how to use the course webpage. So if you go to Earth Regenerators, on the left sidebar is an option for courses, and you can click on courses and then come to this course section, Living into the Design Pathway. And what I want to just briefly show you is a little bit of the content on this page. First thing is, if you go to this activity feed and click on it, this will show you where articles are posted, homework assignments, announcements for events. You can post your own articles and content there as well. And you can go there to read and comment on the posts of other people. Another place you can go is the table of contents, which is where our homework and course activities will be held, which includes the 3 homework activities that were given this week prior to today's webinar. So those of you who haven't done that homework can go to this table of contents and find the big picture agenda and the 3 homework activities. Another place you can go is to members, where you can see who else is here and reach out to people that you've been meeting in the community Zoom calls, or someone that posted an interesting comment and you'd like to talk to them more. So you can actually connect directly peer-to-peer with other members. This is the events section where you can go and sign up for the next webinar, for the other community Zoom calls, and anything else that we might host during the learning journey. And finally, up here in the right-hand corner, where I have this final star, this is where you can go for one-on-one chats. So you can go there and type in the name of another member of the course and send them a direct message to reach out to them, and they'll receive the message like an internal email system. And so this is just like Facebook Messenger, except within Mighty Networks. So if at any time you want to talk to another member of this course, you can find them there, including reaching out to the hosts team and myself. Another thing I want to share before closing this webinar is that we created the Regenerative Project Incubator from the previous learning journey in regenerative finance that ended about 3 weeks ago. And this project incubator has been prototyping itself through a set of activities of creating advisory circles, offering design sessions, hosting teach-ins, and providing office hours for one-on-one conversations. What I want to let you all know is, Elise, please be more quiet. Show courtesy, please. I asked you to be more quiet. Thank you. Is that this Regenerative Project Incubator is running in parallel with our learning journey and is available to all of the members here. So you can reach out to PJ Connolly, who's a member of this course, to ask how to join the Project Incubator. And it will be another support space to help us. We'll be able to make use of it during the learning journey in the next couple months. And we'll show you ways to get involved in it as time passes. So with that said, let's have a discussion. Let's start talking about all of this. How do we begin this journey together? What questions are jumping out and lingering for you? And how do we begin in earnest? So with that said, I'll stop screen sharing and we can have a conversation. So I see, hello everyone. I hope that the technology worked well for the presentation and that at least wasn't making too much noise in the background. I also see that I went longer than I thought I would, and I've used up quite a bit of the time, which means we might just go a few minutes over our hour today, and I hope that's okay. I can see here that one question that has gotten the most questions is from someone who didn't give their name, so I don't know who it is. Oh, Marcus, I see Marcus. Okay, so Marcus asked this question. So Marcus, I'll invite you onto the screen so we can discuss it. And the question is this: could you please elaborate on extractive cultures becoming compost? What would that mean more concretely? So Marcus, I've just sent you an invite. So if you're available, you could accept it and join me in video, and we can talk about it. Sometimes there's a time delay for this, but it looks like it's working. Hey there, Marcus, how's it going?
Hello, everybody. Hi, Joe. Very well.
Yeah, you asked a really good question here about how do we compost the extractive cultures. I think the first lesson is that compost is dead and decaying material. So like you take your food scraps from the salad that we were making for lunch and you put them in a compost bucket, and they're the part that is no longer part of the living plant. And this is an important lesson for us, is as the extractive cultures die, because they're inherently self-terminating, they destroy their own conditions for being alive, they sort of give us a lot of raw material to work from. So part of it is just learning how to sense into that. And I'm curious if you have any experiences yourself observing or doing this work of composting an extractive culture. I can give you one example from my life to maybe give some concreteness to it. So when my wife and I started making our transition to a regenerative life, one of the first things we did was we sold our car when we moved to Seattle, because there was good bike infrastructure and good public transit, which means we were depending on the extractive culture, but we gave up our car, which was a really expensive cost. And that reduced the annual cost of living for us by about 20%, which meant that we had to work less hard to survive, which meant we had a little bit more free time we could put into making life choices and making changes in our lives. So part of the composting was letting go of our car and starting to open up space to explore a less costly way of living, while we were still heavily dependent on the extractive economy at the time. But our composting of it was things we did, like our vacations were doing bike tours to remote places, going camping and living off grid. And those nature connections for us were sort of decolonizing our minds and doing things that you'd say were composting the extractive culture in our lifestyle choices, while also decarbonizing our lives a little bit. So that's an example from our lives. But I'm curious, what comes up for you? Like, what do you think I meant by that? Or do you have any examples that you could think of in your own life for how to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I have the same experience of living without car for decades. But I mean, this is at the individual level, and my question was targeting the collective level, because the cars didn't go away, so we have more cars than ever before. So I was asking this question from this collective perspective, and is this composting only meaning, the materials that have been accumulated in certain ways by extractive economies, or culture also are kind of non-material values and practices and attitudes and so on? How do they compost?
Well, metaphorical composting would be taking knowledge that was gained from a university education, and instead, which is preparing for a job in the extractive economy for most people, and applying it to doing regenerative work. So like, I studied physics when I was an undergraduate student. It turns out the most valuable thing that a physicist learns, if they're well taught, is how to set up a problem. What are the physical processes involved? How does that let me make simplifying assumptions so that I can find a solution that still basically works? And this ability to set up the problem is something that can be applied to other complex settings, not just to physics problems. So you could think of it as composting as the intellectual nutrient is now being used to feed some kind of regenerative process by using it to solve problems in a different context. So that's like a cultural form of composting. So another example that comes to mind is Cuba, when the US had a trade embargo against Cuba, and Cuba didn't have fossil fuels made available to them for about 15 years. And so what they did was they rapidly decarbonized their society with a great public transit system and lots of bicycles. And they invested heavily in universities and medical schools in particular, and created a world-class healthcare system. And so while the Cuban economy is now more strongly fossil fuel dependent, they have some great examples of regenerative agriculture, really great examples of regenerative medicine, and very good examples of social welfare systems for education and medical care. So that's a societal scale example of something that at least hints at the kind of thing we're talking about, even though it's not a complete transition. But I don't know, does that help start to answer the question a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely, because I like these answers at different levels. Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Marcus, nice to meet you and welcome. I'm glad you're here.
You're welcome.
Awesome. I'm going to jump to the next question because of time, but it's great to meet you, Marcus. Thanks for being here. So that's a nice example of how we use the question and answer tool. I see our next question here is by Bob Bates, so I'll invite Bob onto the screen. And this question is, are there divergent maps on what is exactly a specific bioregion? And if so, which one should we be using for our local studies? So this is a great question, Bob, and I hope you're able to join me. I hope the technology works for you to join me. I'll start by saying for non-human cultures, bioregions are easier to define because you look at the niche and the habitat of the organism. Sort of my go-to example is a starfish in an intertidal zone on the coast of the ocean. And you're like, oh, the starfish, its whole life system is in this intertidal zone. So its bioregion is that ecological space. The thing that makes it more complex for humans is there's a blending of culture and ecology for how human economy works. And so the exact boundaries of the bioregion are partially dependent on culture, technology, institutions, trade networks, and things like this, which means there's not a single definition of a bioregion. There's some interpretation of what its boundary could be. But I'd love to talk with you about this. I know that you live in Tennessee, fairly close to the farm, right? Am I understanding that correctly, or you're not in that area?
Yeah, about an hour away.
Nice, because they've been working on bioregionalism for quite a while in their own sense. So I'm curious what your sense of the bioregionalism movement is and how we try to answer this question. Like, what have been your experiences in just trying to live locally that you see either there is clarity, like, oh, this is a bioregion, or we have no clue if this is a bioregion. We're just like feeling around in the dark. I'm curious what your sense of that is.
Yeah, most people are just feeling around the dark. I'm still feeling around in the dark. I've got a sense of a regional kind of thing, but looking on the internet, looking at different websites and stuff, they've got different bioregions defined, but that's a physical bioregion. And like you said, part of the bioregions include cultural kind of things, and it's a little deeper in complexity than just the physical aspect of it.
Yeah,
and,
like one question I know that Peter Berg from the Planet Drum Foundation in San Francisco, he developed a lot of training materials on bioregionalism. And one of the starting points is he'd have a group of students in a workshop, and he would say, take a piece of paper and draw an X in the middle. That's where you live. That's your home. Like, that's where your house is. Draw on this map, where does your water come from? And he found that most people were just embarrassed because they had no idea, no clue where their water comes from. What's interesting is when you actually answer the question, where does your water come from? And then the second question is, have you ever visited the source of your water? Which has a natural follow-up. Well, if you haven't, maybe you should go there. Just walk to it. Drive a car, like, go visit it. And you start to see there's a naturally organizing boundary of how water flows through a landscape, which is a good starting point for thinking about a bioregion. It doesn't fully answer the question, but it really gets you on the right path, at least, for thinking about it.
How big can it be? I mean, some of these maps are fairly small, and some of them are larger. Some have large watersheds, some have small watersheds.
Yeah,
so I'm not really sure if you're trying to network with other people, how far you should be looking, or out of what bounds from your region should you be looking to try and network with other people.
Yeah, the question of network distance is largely a question of the energy system and the transportation system. What kind of energy and transport are assumed? So, like, do we assume that we have asphalt highways and 18-wheeler trucks running on gasoline? Then that gives you a very different sense of distance than like here where we live in Colombia. For about 300 years, the primary form of transport was stone paths in the mountains and people walking with a string of 5 or 6 donkeys. And it's like, and each donkey could hold about 400 pounds of materials. So you could have 2 or 3 tons of materials in a caravan of donkeys. And so the question of energy and transport really tells you a lot about what the extent of a trade network could be for defining the bioregion. And the assumptions are usually around technology and infrastructure, is where you can sort of do reality checks on it. But you're absolutely right that there's not a single definition and there's not a single size. Like some of the easier ones to define would be things like an island or a coastal estuary, where you could say, oh, well, you could do all your fishing in this coastal estuary. You might trade up and down the coast a little bit. Like say what would happen in the Salish Sea, Puget Sound and area around Seattle, or the San Francisco Bay Area, as an example, where there's a fairly well-contained catchment system. Or it might be an extended trade network like you'd think of in the semi-nomadic patterns of the people of the Great Plains, where their bioregion might be 1,000 miles across because it's nomadic seasonal patterns. And so it really is going to be different depending on the context. But just
you want to
asking
try
the
and keep
question is
your
gonna help.
bioregion as small as you can, depending on energy and transportation.
Yeah.
So they don't get too expensive or too out of whack in time and energy.
Yeah, I would say you want enough network connection to other places to have resilience, which is that there's something your community needs, you need more than one place to get it from. So you can have network level resilience by having good trade partnerships, which means your bioregion is sort of nested within a larger federation of some kind of an extended domain of trade, which might be regional or trans-regional, depending. Like if there could be some ocean transport or other things. But the more interesting question to start with is, what does it mean to be sustainable? Or what does it mean to be within ecological limits? And that starts to, get into homesteading questions and more like sustainable living at the community scale, like maybe the scale of an eco-village or something like that. So what's important is asking the question in this way gets you closer to a practical, useful understanding. What is a bioregion, rather than having some agreed definition that everyone uses that may not apply the same in every place. Yes, okay. I can at least. Does that help for at least starting the conversation about it a little bit?
Sure.
It's such an important question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and looking forward to more. It's nice to meet you, Bob. I just want to hold awareness that we're a little over the time that we had originally set, because I went so long in my presentation. So I apologize for that, for going a little long. And what I'd love to do now is just quickly go through how we can get these other questions answered without going over more time today, because I can see some people are already starting to leave the session as we've gone beyond the time. And that is to say that I can capture these questions and we can start to explore them in a post that I'll put into the course page. So I'll grab all the questions that weren't answered, and I'll just pose all of them as questions and we can start discussions about them in the comment thread below them. So I'll do that to allow us to stay mostly on time for now. And what I just want to say at this point, because we are going a bit over time, is that I hope this opening webinar is giving us a context for having a shared sense of what we're getting ourselves into here as we start to do this. And that in the community calls tomorrow and Monday, we'll have the opportunity to get into small group discussions where you'll get to talk to each other about some of the topics that were being presented today. You could think of my presentation today as sort of like I'm poking and prodding with ideas that we don't have enough time to explore, so that we can use the next 2 months to explore them one after the other in different levels of depth as we go along. And that just want to say, I'm really glad you're all here, and I'm excited to be on this journey with all of you. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me personally or to the other members of our host team, which are Tara Daly, David Abramson, David Bard, and Claire Atwell. And otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. I'm looking forward to learning together, and let's get going. I'll see you all tomorrow or Monday in the Zoom calls and in next week's webinar, which I'll prepare the agenda for and put an event up for next Saturday pretty soon. So thank you all for being here, and onward, fellow humans.